Third part of Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. Now, a lot of what I've been mentioning in the last part in particular is all about the structure and the punctuation. Now, what I tell my students is that you need 5 things in a really good literature paragraph. You need 3 inferences from your quote, some language and some context. Now, it's much easier to write about the language when it's something really obvious like a simile or an oxymoron. This poem isn't full of loads of language techniques like that. There are 1 or 2, and we'll come on to some repetition and a metaphor a little bit later. But what it is full of is interesting structural ideas and interesting punctuation, which are just as valid as a simile, a metaphor, a personification, or something obvious like that. And the reason that they're just as valid is because the poets are using everything that's in their tool bag to effect. So we talked about the rhyming couplets that Browning uses to emphasise control. We've talked about the punctuation used to show the patterns of normal speech and his control in his own pauses. So do write about those as much as you write about any obvious language features. So don't feel that you're missing out on the language by talking about the structure. Just as valid, just as important. And actually, for those wanting to get the higher grades, the sort of 7s, 8s, 9s end, mixing language and structure is exceptionally vital, that you do that to show the examiner you understand the whole number of ways that the poet puts a poem together and the number of different methods that he or she might use. Okay, so just as in the last part, instead of reading through the poem and focusing on all of it, we're going to focus on just a few key quotes from this part. And instead of a key quote, pick out the ones that you feel most comfortable with. Because as I've said, I think this is one of the more difficult poems in the anthology. Understand the story and understand a few of the key quotes that you can get an awful lot out of. Like the wet sponge, squeeze as much out as you possibly can. Okay, so we're going to start with the part where Browning, in role as the Duke of Ferrara, remember that Browning is the poet, he's the constructor of the character of the Duke of Ferrara based on historical evidence, but these are not the actual words that the Duke of Ferrara said, it's Browning's imagination, and actually comes on to start mocking the Duke of Ferrara, this character that he's created based on history, a little bit later on the poem. But we're going to start with the bit where the Duke is complaining about the number of things that annoyed him about his last Duchess and everything that impressed her. So he talks about my favourite, her breast. So even if I gave her favour, it was the same as the dropping of the daylight in the west, the sunset. The bough of cherries, some officious fool broke in the orchard for her. Notice that one of his staff has been kind enough to take her some cherries, but he calls her or him an officious fool for doing so. Now, this is not a happy household, and yet somebody has taken the time to pick some cherries for the Duchess, which shows me a couple of things. It shows me, one, that there was some kindly staff in there, but I think she must have been much more approachable. She must have been much more kind to the staff, as is hinted on throughout, and that annoyed him. So he calls this servant an officious fool. His anger comes out through there. The white mule she rode round with the terrace. So all of those things pleased his last Duchess, but he criticised her. He says that she was too soon made glad, too easily impressed. Now notice the repetition of those twos. To is an adverb, but it sort of intensifies and emphasises his anger. She was too soon made glad, so too quick to become happy, too easily impressed. And that repetition of to, that adverb to intensify his feeling, brings out that disgust. He finds that just impossible to deal with. He cannot empathise at all with being happy with other things other than status and money and wealth. So that sense of disgust comes through. It's also his sense of jealousy. Remember that all of those things, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries, the white mule, are equal to his favour and the 900 years old name, all of those things are equal. And actually, he's jealous of that. He feels he's done much more for his Duchess than bring you some cherries or a horse that rides around. What is interesting is that that is also quite ironic, isn't it? Because his gift of a 900 years old name is actually for his status. So all of those other gifts are brought with some sincerity, with real feeling behind them. So it's ironic that he feels that that gift should be higher than the others, when the others were brought with kindness and his was brought only with his own self-interest. So this is where Robert Browning is starting to mock the Duke of Ferrara through this sense of irony. But also that sense of jealousy can't be distinguished and can't be kept apart from that power and control. He feels that his gifts are much more important, much more vital than anyone else's gifts. So that brings us neatly onto my gift of a 900 years old name. Now I think Robert Browning here is mocking the Duke of Ferrara, a 900 years old name. It does sound ridiculous, doesn't it? And yes, we know that patriarchy passed from father to son, possibly to nephew if there were no male heirs. It would have gone down the male line of the family. What has he actually done for that? Nothing, except be lucky that fate has brought him to be born to these parents. But he feels that that makes him more grand, more important, more worthy of her attention than any cherries or mule or sunset. And so that ironic mocking that Robert Browning is making of the character that he creates of the Duke of Ferrara is really important. This might tell us something about the poet. This might tell us that the poet is mocking those who are in nobility. Now, what's interesting in the context is that Robert Browning and his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was also a famous poet, they escaped very controlling fathers and ran off to Italy to get married. So maybe Robert Browning is mocking those who feel that status gives them something. Robert Browning was born into a wealthy family in London. I think they were bankers. And he escaped that sense of family, that sense of status, to become a poet, to marry the woman that he loved. And so I think some of that anger that Browning had himself, some of that mocking, maybe is mocking his own father, that he tried to impose this sense of status on his son. We are a better family than others, perhaps. And no, Robert Browning was having none of that, and uses the Duke of Ferrara maybe as a metaphor for his own experiences and the ridiculousness of status through families. So that mocking tone is really important, and link that in your context to Robert Browning's own experiences with his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Remember, they both escaped very controlling fathers. Okay, this grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. Now, I haven't picked out a key quote, but if there is a key quote in the poem, it is this. This is the central part of the poem. This is the part where we know that he's had her killed. He doesn't say, I had her killed. Look at this central part, I gave commands. He doesn't say, I killed her, or even, I gave commands to have her killed. I gave commands. He stops short. Remember in the last part, I talked about how he's very careful with his language. This is another example where he's careful with his language. He's vague and ambiguous. We all know his meaning. We all know he's had her killed, but he's being deliberately vague. He's letting his reader, he's letting his listener put those bits and pieces together without incriminating himself, without admitting his guilt. This grew. So this, as in all of her happiness and other things, this grew. I gave commands. Okay, he stopped short of saying what he commanded. Then all smiles stopped together. That's a logical conclusion. That whatever commands he's given, it has stopped all the smiling. Now, he might have told her, look, you've got to stop smiling, but we know she's dead. So we can put two and two together. And that is emphasised by the semicolons. What semicolons do is link closely related sentences. They link one idea to the next idea. And Browning is very clever in his use of his semicolons here to link these ideas together. This grew, that annoyed him, and the link there is that annoyed him, and so he gave commands. And the link there with the semicolon is that all smiles stopped together. the logical conclusion that his disgust and annoyance at her happiness, at her equality of favour from him to the servants, has annoyed him so much that he's given commands to have her killed. Now, that suggests his power is ultimate. He's able to have the ultimate power over life and death of his wife. And that runs through, doesn't it, that sense of power. Now, the poem finishes, remember all the time that he's talking to the representative of his next Duchess. And after he's shown her this painting, remember, kept aside, that use of brackets that we looked at earlier on, he's now taking this representative downstairs and he shows another work of art. Notice though, Neptune, Tame Your Seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Just like he did with Fra Pandolf and the repetition of that famous artist, he has to mention who has made this sculpture, who's cast it in bronze. Bronze, again, a very expensive metal, so we can imagine the fortune that he spent on this piece of artwork. And he names the sculptor Claus of Innsbruck, and he's supposed to be impressive, and his audience, the person listening to his monologue, is also supposed to be impressed that he's got Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Notice it's not just a piece of artwork he's bought, it's a piece of artwork he's commissioned. He has got the artist to go and make this piece of artwork for him. But the actual art itself is important. Neptune, Tame Your Seahorse. Sounds ridiculous to us because we think of seahorses as tiny little creatures, but we've got to imagine this mythical four-legged sea beast, a seahorse, which Neptune tames. Neptune was the Roman god of the sea, and we can imagine him with his trident, plunging his trident into the neck of this enormous sea creature. Probably quite a hideous piece of art. But the piece of art itself is metaphorical. It's a metaphor. And what's it a metaphor for? Well, Neptune is in the position of a command over a less worthy creature. He's killing that less worthy creature. It's not a huge jump for us to think that Neptune is a metaphor for the Duke of Ferrara himself, and that the seahorse is everything that is under his control, perhaps Lucretia, his last Duchess. And that whole piece of art is a metaphor for the Duke of Ferrara having control, like a god, like Neptune, over all under his command. Now that, again, that boastful finish to the poem brings it back round to the start. It's another poem with a cyclical structure that he moves on to another piece of art, and they discuss the next marriage. We started with That's My Last Duchess painted on the wall, and we move on to speech about the Count's known munificence, no amount of pretence for dowry. So they're talking the financial implications of the marriage. So they come full circle back round to talking about the next marriage, having moved on to the next piece of art. So where does My Last Duchess go in terms of linking? It certainly can be linked with any other poem about power and about command. So you could probably, if you really liked this poem, link it with any other, because all of the anthology is about power and conflict. So you talk about his ultimate power over Lucretia, to any other poem that shows the power of something. But they're weaker links. The one it goes closest with is Ozymandias, who of course again was a single figure of power. Personally, it's not one that I would use to link with others, except with Ozymandias. But if you did really like this poem, or if it came up as the named poem, you've got enough information there to squeeze lots out of. And there are lots of other poems that go with it, because it is a poem purely about power and control.